Good evening, mi gente. This is Ray Collazo, and you're watching and listening to the Founded Translation Bomba Live simulcast. Founded Translations to show the stack's truth about politics and today's hottest issues. And the truth sometimes is found in allyship, and that's one of the big themes of today's show. Later on in the show, we're going to have an interview with Filipina activist Argentina Beltran just on that issue. How do we show allyship with the Filipino, not only Filipino-American community, but the Filipino diaspora throughout the world? Our Pacific Islanders are particularly being impacted by this scourge of anti-AAPI hate, hashtag stop the hate, Asian hate. And so we have a very diverse set of Asian American and Pacific Island activists having part of this conversation. And we'll get into some of the political headlines later on in the show. But first, I want to introduce a great friend to the show, someone that we've been living the lyrics with for a little while now, since our college years. And she's going to help us not only her perspective on how, in my case, as Latinos, as many of our audience members, as non-Asian Americans, can show allyship with the Asian American community at this very critical time in our history, and catch us up also as a Minnesota activist about the climate and sort of what she's seeing and observing from the Derek Chauvin trial, that lessons we can learn as we continue to try to support each other from a BIPOC perspective. So, and then we'll have other special guests join in a moment. But first, let's introduce my buddy, a very special guest to the show, activist Liz Kaufman. Liz, finally welcome to Bomba Live. Liz, it's been way overdue, my friend. How are you? Unmute yourself, Liz.
Sorry. Yes, it's really great to be here. I'm really excited. Thank you for having me.
No, let me tell you something. I don't get to Minnesota as often as I'd like, but me and Liz keep in touch. Me and Liz are part of a very exclusive Instagram message group. And you would think with all of these, activists, educators, I mean, it's such a diverse group of people. You know what we end up IGing about? Also hip hop.
Yeah.
So shout out to our IG group, Augie, Tony, the whole crew, because who knows? Maybe we'll get into that, Liz, at some point. Liz, it's great to see you. You have been really a leader in this conversation for as long as I've known you. And I thought it was very appropriate that not only during this time in our history, where the Asian American community, in this unfortunate circumstance, is sort of in the spotlight, but also it's Asian American History Month. So we want to celebrate the great contributions of our AAPI community with our country. So Liz, before we introduce our other guests, and Elbert Garcia is going to be part of this conversation, our producer as well. Beyond anything, you're a Minnesotan and you're a Minnesota social justice activist. So just from the perspective of someone that, pre-Philando Castile even was engaged in these issues around policing and social justice in the Twin Cities, just your observations on the climate locally and just how you're feeling as an activist as the Derek Chauvin trial progresses.
Yeah, thank you. So the Chauvin trial has just been difficult on multiple levels. And I have been following these issues for, I guess, maybe about 25 years. And the work that I did was largely in New York, but I've tried to stay engaged with what's happening. So first, I just want to extend my condolences to the family and friends of George Floyd and all of us who are grieving. It's really just been a difficult time. The whole world watched Derek Chauvin kill George Floyd. And it's really just over the last year pointed to how many lives have been impacted and the amount of pain that our communities are living with. I've only been able to watch clips of the trial. There's really just a lot there, and it's pretty re-traumatizing to watch. And so a couple of clips that come to mind were one of a first responder who was not allowed by the police to carry out her duties to assist George Floyd. And then also some testimony of bystanders, witnesses who have just spent the past year just really thinking about what they wish they would have done. And it's really just a horrible, traumatic thing to put people through, where they're taking it, upon themselves and internalizing it because they were there. And so one way, racism works is it makes an example of people on a public stage to say, this is what can happen to you. And people just, we relive it over and over. So it's just been traumatizing, from the murder to how it was handled afterwards. They wanted to move the trial out of the Twin Cities, the way that they handled the jury selection. They were looking for people who either didn't know about the case or didn't have an opinion. And that's a really strong political position. That's not neutral. That's a political position. And so that's what the system is. And the larger trauma is that we've seen this happen over and over. And I thought a lot about the Diallo trial in New York, and just the pattern of, no charges or a moved trial, no conviction, shortened sentences. And it brings us to the larger root question of what is justice? What do we envision? How do we build it? Because it's not found in the carceral system.
Wow, and that's a very powerful statement, Liz. And as you were talking about the trauma that the witnesses, just people that were standing on the street, and at the end of the day, regardless of what the defendants trying to say, they never attacked the police. They never got real aggressive with the police. They were just there and trying to be human beings at this moment, right? And I think about it. I don't talk about it much on the show because it's more my dad's story. But I was there. Me and my dad were just hanging out, basically, going to a social event, and we got caught in the crossfire. My dad got hit, and I didn't. And it was because, thank God, it was a low caliber gun, and it hit him in the right spot, and he was able to survive it. We've gone through. I've gone through guilt over the years because I'm like, he kind of took one for me, and just being the trauma of that moment and thinking about the trauma that he went through, because there was a moment where we had gotten separated in the melee and him not knowing if I'd got shot or not. I'm a little skinny 13-year-old kid. So, who would have known if that bullet had hit me in the wrong spot? So, there's so much trauma in the inner city that we go through that gets ignored oftentimes by our community from not only a policing perspective, but like a mental health perspective. Liz, what else should people know? It's been, about a year now, and, we dedicated a big part of our first annual Bomba Live Puerto Rico celebration to the memory of George Floyd. We had Maria Isa, one of your sisters up in Minnesota, be one of our performers. She knew him personally. She did a bomba, which is traditional Afro-Puerto Rican music, song in his honor during the program. So we really focused on it, but, nearly a year later, just being a Minnesota activist, how are people feeling up there? I mean, we're like reliving it all over again,
Yeah. I think it's a combination of the intensity of what happened last year, how everything kind of played out, and just, thinking about what will happen as the trial proceeds. And then I think also there's all the work that's going on. There's lots of, grassroots movement work that's been happening, that's always happening. And I think, that we find our hope in that, and really, reaching out for new connections, building relationships, really looking at root causes of issues, and just knowing that we need a broad-based, multiracial, intergenerational, cross-issue movement for us to win. And it's become apparent that we need to keep building. The system is going to keep playing out the way it does, and we just have to keep building with each other.
Allyship and building and solidarity, and really what's real solidarity, because that's been an interesting conversation that we've been all going through, and I think on some level, for lack of a better term, struggling with over the last several weeks, particularly as it relates to supporting the Asian American community. And another brother and I call him a brother because he's a friend and someone that really is really schooling us around how do we develop these collaborations and what true allyship means. I want to bring to the show activist and really a great thinker as it relates to these issues, our great friend Ben Cheng. Ben, what's up, brother? Ben, smile. If I was that handsome, I would be smiling from ear to ear all the time. How are you, my friend? I think you're on mute, brother.
It wouldn't be a virtual show without me and Liz doing the same thing. So that thanks for having me. It's great to be back. I
appreciate you, brother. And my my ride or die brother, producer of the show, and someone that shares a very special anniversary with me and Liz. Elbert Garcia, brother. Guess who's back again? Guess who's back? Tell a friend. Guess who's back? Elbert, what's up, brother?
I'm trying to not, I was gonna think about maybe muting my mic just so that I could like flow into the same conversation. No,
exactly.
Yeah, no, always a pleasure to be here with you, Ray, and always a pleasure to hang out. With Liz. Great to meet you, Ben. I tell you, it's again, it's we're living in really important times, and it's good to know that folks like y'all are really hanging out there and really on the front lines of the work that needs to be done. So
before we get to the anniversary, the special anniversary the three of us share, many other activists, Ben, I'm gonna school you about how down Liz is. Liz is one of the realest in the game. You don't understand. I mean, you just got the tip of the iceberg. 2000, I'm at the Democratic National Convention in LA. And, I'm a young activist. Me and my buddy score one ticket for the DNC. So we literally take turns outside the Staples Center going in and out of the convention. I get kicked out of the SEIU VIP suite. They're like, who's this? He's not one of the state directors of our union. Get the hell out of here. All this craziness. We end up connecting after the convention, after Al Gore spoke, right? 2000, right?
Yeah,
Al Gore spoke, a group of activists. We end up connecting, some of our LA friends, Tony and Augie and the whole crew that are watching this. And I said, well, so listen, so what are you doing here? Like, I'm an act, I'm in voter registration, Latino, trying to work. And so I was at Staples Center. I said, what have you done here? She goes, I'm outside protesting for Puerto Rican political prisoners to be released. That's what I'm doing. No, small Liz made me feel like, damn, I ain't real. Liz is real. Much love to your sister. Elbert, you were as central to it as any of us. The three of us and dozens of Asian American and Latino and students of color and other allies. Columbia alum celebrated a very special 25th year anniversary recently. So why don't you share with us, Elbert, that moment in the spring in our college years that we wanted to share a moment about today?
Yeah, I just want to kind of put this up. So April 1st, 1996, a bunch of Columbia students, really a coalition, right, of Asian American, African American, and Latino students began a hunger strike, right, for a combined ethnic studies department, right? Because for years and really decades, the university had kind of given short change. They said that they were kind of promising not only to increase classes for the Institute for African American Studies, but also promising to support other programs. And after several years of fits and starts, a coalition of grad students and undergrads just got tired. And we had been really kind of working and meeting with different coalitions and committees and faculty committees and things of that nature for a while. And we decided just to take some action, right? And again, a lot of it was the administration just not thinking that they could basically kind of ride out these student activists that they had done years and years and years for a while, and we did. So a coalition of folks decided to kind of start that, and it started. If I remember right, I think it ended up being a 16-day hunger strike. And we had a number of different, even mini actions. We took over Broadway at some point.
Yeah.
We took off. Ultimately, we took over the main administration building, which was Low Library. We took that for about 14 hours until New York City Police came in on campus. It had been the first time since 1968 that New York City Police had been on Columbia's campus since the anti-war movement. And in fact, there were 23 arrests that day. 22 of them were women. In terms of throwing down to both our Barnard sisters as well as Columbia women being arrested. And eventually, the hunger strike led to a number of different things. It's certainly the formation of the Latino Studies major and Asian American Studies majors there, some commitments to faculty, and eventually a Center for Studies in Race, Ethnicity, and Race, right? So certainly a bunch of things that started. And the other thing that's important too is that it was part of a wave of different folks of color at different Ivy League colleges that were really that were really trying to take over and trying to, kind of push their institutions to do better, right? The year before had been a very famous Asian American and Latino studies takeover at Princeton, in which they took over the president's office there, in which we were inspired by. And even the year before that, there had been one at Cornell. And the Harvard folks tried to do that, I think, as well. And they kind of similarly got shut down. But these are still issues in terms of academic access and fighting white supremacy. So much so that even last year, Harvard students had taken over, at least for a short amount of time before the pandemic, their president's office to try to demand, an ethnic studies department, or at least curriculum over there. So, but it all started 25 years ago on April 1st. There was no April Fools before just when emails were starting, before Instagram, before really like major internet stuff was, pretty much, us kind of on those battle lines.
God, it's we could sit here and the lessons and the I mean, really, there needs to be a documentary done about it. We could throw all the names out of the wonderful people that were part of it. But with the time that we have, Liz, just your reflections, thinking about those experiences. What does that time period teach to you that you take with you to continue your work?
Yeah, I think about that time a lot. It was one of the most impactful experiences of my life, moving to New York from the Twin Cities at 18, and then coming into this really vibrant movement that was happening. And so I think one of the most powerful parts for me was just the multiracial aspect of it, the fact that that students were really just taking their own power, learning from each other. There were teach-ins. Everything was just driven from the students, the whole strategy, and it just moved through, like, all the different tactics that we used, and I think it really was an example of democracy, and I think about it quite a bit.
And again, there'll be other I'm sure documentarians and scholars will document this, and at some point we'll all get interviewed about it. But I remember how hard it was. And I'm saying that in a positive way because there was, we were all coming from, even though we're all people of color, we're all coming, and I'm not even talking about the ethnic part. We're all coming from very different places. Some of us were hood kids. Some of us were kind of in the middle. Some of us grew up, fairly well-to-do. Some of us were ideological. Some of us were practical. So, different movements sort of layered in. I mean, it seems like it sort of built. April 1st was a buildup of about a semester. And so in the middle of this movement, we then had a lot of intersectional conversations around gender identity, and that probably looking back on it, were very sort of ahead of its time in a sense. And just a lot of ideology and just a lot of things that were hard to get through, and just and then really this is sort of like, the BC level of the internet, where it was basically an email campaign. And so just lots of lessons. Ben, I want to get you in this conversation because we fast forward to today, and allyship is more important than ever. And so obviously, we stand in solidarity with the Floyd family, but now moving to the conversation related to, the Asian American community is literally under attack, and all of this ugliness that we often don't like to talk about as it relates to the othering of the Asian American community, the dehumanization, the invisibility. And so just want to get your initial reflections on how you're feeling, brother, on a personal level, and what's this moment as an activist and someone that's focused on building allyship, your thoughts on this moment right now.
Absolutely, Ray. I appreciate the time and the thoughts. So for me, I think it really hits hard, and I think I can speak for some of our AAPI community in that I think for the one thing that comes to mind is that it is you bring up the othering, right? And the othering has to do a little bit with like the traditional silence of our communities, and I think, in my perspective, the silence has a lot to do with the way we were raised. Like our parents coming in and their values. Growing up, I was taught in the face of conflict, right? We just walk away. We don't speak up, and in face of what we want to get to, we just sort of work hard, put our head down, work hard, and hope it sort of works out. And when I'm hearing Elbert's story, I think it helps me realize, for one, right? This is not a zero-sum game, right? It's all these communities coming together for a common goal. And I think among the AAPI community now, I've seen an awakening among my friends, not just academics, but across all industries. Just it doesn't even cut that way, right? It's just talking and thinking about how we can speak up, and we're having conversations about how, and actually with our parents, and they're saying, "Why are you speaking up?" And we're saying we have to speak up, right? Like we have to speak up to live, right? And so for us, it's almost like, I don't want to like, it's for the first time that I hate that it's taken this tragic, awful event, in Atlanta to sort of quote unquote awaken some people, but it really has. And I'm having deep conversations with some friends that I never even thought about these issues.
You know what? I think I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's been my observation. And I think there's two pieces here, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Ben. Is that one, I think on some level, like, the fact that, well, I think one of the biggest dynamics in this is that, in particular, the attacks on the Asian American elderly community, because not only kind of like on a personal level, and I know my Asian American brothers are particularly like, "Are you messing with my mom?" Like there's a visceral piece there, but then culturally, obviously, everyone honors their elders, but the Asian American Pacific Island community, I mean, that is such a tenet of y'all culture across the board. So can you speak to like just extrapolate what you just talked about in terms of like what's now the conversation happening within the community around now? What do you do, and what can you do now to just, first of all, protect the family, but also now, how does this elevate more conversation around visibility and power with the Asian American community?
Absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely spot on, Ray. I mean, our elderly community, our parents, that generation, we are taught to respect them to the highest degree. So when we're watching these horrific videos, it sort of hits a core. I'm not saying it doesn't affect other communities as well, but from that perspective, it really hits us very deeply and very, very sensitively. And so there have been organizing events where, from the simplest, like, let's just check in with our parents, make sure they're okay, right? Like, I mean, we're all into quarantine, but let's just check in, all the way to organizing, like, people making sure people are going to nursing homes and elderly communities and walking with them, like setting up systems. So they need to go somewhere, either drive them there or walk with them, and try to strengthen the community that way. And I think, in terms of visibility and what to do, I want to give a shout out to my Latina sister, Judy Perez Caro, who's on the show too, who is my business partner. And we have a D&I consulting business, Perez and Chang. But she has taught me, right, that we have, in terms of speaking up and visibility, right, we need to start to take up space, right? And I think that's been a lot of this conversation where, like, in some ways, when our communities are featured on the news, a lot of times it's something we want to shy away from. We don't want to draw that attention. But I think we want to have more conversation in the API community of taking up space, of showing the spotlight, and attending things like, bystander trainings and teaching, which is a strategy to teach, onlookers to distract or to indirectly or directly insert themselves, right? We want to break that sort of silence, and we want to break that natural sort of freezing response that we have, that sort of, I'll speak from the I perspective, that I was taught in how to react.
Ray, I was about to say that I think it's also important to remember that it's retapping in that tradition and history of activism, right? Because I think it would be a mistake to think that this is something new, right? And I think that's what's so kind of flipped and weird, right, about the world that we live in, that how quickly we can kind of forget that, right? And so I think that's part of it, is kind of tapping into I think what was so great about that experience back at Columbia was also knowing, and it was relearning in some ways that history, right? And in terms of both in the current sense and also in the traditional sense, right? In terms of, Asian American men and women, right, who were on the front lines, right, of the civil rights movement, in terms of civil rights, episodes, not just in the United States, but also in terms of activism around the world, in terms of their own countries. And in some ways, the story of not just in terms of being silent, but also being silenced, right? And in terms of the Asian American activism tradition that there is, that I think that you would be hard pressed to sometimes find, and but that is there, right? And especially the long-standing, unfortunately, tradition of hate, right, towards levied against the Asian American community, the API community, certainly, obviously, starting first from in terms of the Chinese Exclusionary Act. And a whole bunch of things, right? And kind of retapping into that, right? I mean, and again, people will be surprised to know that when it comes to like modern feminism, like Asian American women were there at the forefront with Black women in terms of creating around like reproductive justice and reproductive access, right? I mean, there's a bunch of tradition in terms of there that I think, it's also important that also we create space for folks to also rediscover and be proud of that kind of that stuff. Because I think literally the Asian American community, like a number of other communities here in the United States, has had their history also suppressed and repressed as well.
Well, and it's about not remembering your history. And so I think about 2015, 2016, when Trump's anti-Mexican, anti-Latino rhetoric, anti-immigrant, anti-other rhetoric got into a fever pitch during the campaign. And the conventional wisdom by some people on the right saying, well, he's just kind of saying this, but he's not going to really have an administration like that. And George Takei, the child of an internment camp, sounding the alarm saying, oh, in this country, you can get that bad because I lived through it. And most of us, not saying us, but just most Americans just really just not thinking that's inconceivable that this could happen. Fast forward, what happens to these children on the southern border and many other, in this climate of fear and hate building to this crescendo. Liz, before we go to our first break, Liz, I've been thinking a lot about you in this situation because on a personal level, this has to be an interesting time for you as an activist, as a lifer, because you've always been there for everybody else. Latinos, African-Americans, other progressive causes, women. And now this is an opportunity, almost I don't want to say unique opportunity, but a special moment in time when all of us have to be there for the Asian American community. And I'm sure in Minnesota, people are looking to you for guidance and some leadership. So just wanted your thoughts on you being on the forefront of allyship, and now you having to navigate being essentially a recipient of it.
Yeah, so I was going to add some of the same context that Elby was talking about. As far as Asian American or anti-Asian violence, really having roots in since Asian folks first started coming here in the 1700s, and so we have the coolie trade that used the same ships that transported enslaved Africans. We have law after law denying rights. Asian Americans couldn't go to white schools. They had extra taxes. They couldn't testify against whites, couldn't intermarry. We have scapegoating and mass killings, gender-based violence, and examples of specific targeting, like you were mentioning about the mass incarceration of Japanese and Japanese Americans. And so this moment is occurring in a history of dehumanization, exploitation, and systemic violence. It's the same system of white supremacy and oppressive structures that target and attack, perpetuate racism and discrimination against other marginalized communities. And so I think, we find in history that wherever there's oppression, there's also resistance. And so even though, we have been invisibilized and there's been, erasure and attempts at erasure and suppression of our stories, they're still our stories nonetheless, and people still know them. And so I think building with each other in a way where we are able to tap into that and listen to each other, find elders, find folks who know some of the things that aren't necessarily in the media, and then coming back to all those moments in history where we've stood together, from like the farm workers movement, our overlapping issues with the camps, as you have mentioned, with issues around documentation, workers' rights, housing. We've always lived and worked together in the same communities, and there's so much richness there, and so many times where folks have really built together. And so I think in times where the system is trying to really push divisiveness, this is our moment to really tap into what we know of history and not get caught up in, whatever the mainstream sort of media hype is. And so we continue the legacies that are important to us and that we know we need to survive.
And it's never stopped. It's not like it comes in spurts. Thinking about the ongoing immigration battle, which in particular is coming to a head as it relates to, really a very diverse set of immigrant activist stakeholders. Thinking about our great friend who was part of the ethnic studies movement, Ai-jen Poo, who's been on the forefront of domestic workers and, that home care campaign that she's kicked off, which I'm looking forward to support her on. There's a big kickoff on Saturday. We'll be more on social media. And, so it's never ended. There's always been this allyship. We're going to take a quick break. I'm going to play a short video clip of a musical performance of our great mutual friend, Liz Maria Isa, one of your great Minnesota activists, who, again, did on Bomba Live last year, did an ode to her personal friend as well, George Floyd. And when we come back, I'm going to ask Ben and Liz, so what does allyship look like? Y'all got to school us, because I don't want to assume we know what true allyship look like. Obviously, there's a lot of levels to it. But I think it's an important takeaway that we really get from our two great friends here, what we need to do moving forward to truly show solidarity with the Asian American community in their time of need, because we're with the AAPI brothers and sisters 1,000% here on Bomba Live Found Translations. Hear a little bit from Maria Isa. She breaks it down, and we'll come back and talk to Ben and Liz on this very special edition of Bomba Live.
Fuego, que fuego. Si no corre la gente se va a quemar. Si no corre la gente se va a quemar. Fuego, fuego, Minnesota. Fuego, fuego, Minneapolis. Fuego, fuego para Jorge. Fuego, fuego para los nombres que han matado la policía. Que se largan ya, que yo no quiero sufrir. Mi gente negra no quieren más, no quieren no sufrir. Que todos tenemos que vivir con unidad y no van a sufrir. Ay, cómo duele, 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 cómo duele. Mataron a George como Milando, como Brianna, cómo duele.
I tell you, Maria Isa, much respect to her. Support her music. I mean, she's always coming out with independent music up there. As an activist, has a fantastic podcast of her own, Latina Therapy, I think it's called. And so definitely support her, and we're looking to have her back on the show very soon. So let's start with you, Ben. So look, well, I'm gonna have a confession. I felt awkward about the whole thing. I'm gonna be honest with you, because I'm supposed to know what to do. So when everything started going down, and people said, like, I just thought I did what I thought I was supposed to do. And I reached out to friends like Liz. I said, hey, what up? Hey, just on a personal level, I just want to make sure you're cool, and others. And then, and again, I don't want to sound embarrassed saying this, but I just want to be honest with you. Like, I took my dad out to eat, and we both were like, hey, we should go to Chinatown and represent, it sounds like kind of corny and trite, but I'm just being honest. We're both hot pot nuts. So if we can find a hot pot, that's where we're going to be. So we went down there, and we just wanted to be in community and fellowship and get a good meal. So I'm making light of the situation, but I think, I want to really help us understand, like, what's nice, but what's really impactful. And so, so Ben, why don't you start? And I know Liz has some thoughts on it. So Ben, for people, whether they're Latino or whatever, whatever their background, they just want to show allyship and support for the API community in this moment. So just some thoughts on that topic.
Absolutely. I mean, I love hot pot as much as the next person.
Now he's bugging me because I told him about a Korean one and his name that was closer to him. Now I'm like, hey, COVID, they're not open yet, but it's another.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, supporting your Asian American API business is always a good start. I think, what you mentioned, at the smallest touch point, reaching out, right, to your peers, your friends, sending them a note. Like I'm blessed to have great friends who reach out to me, just saying, hey, I'm with you. What can I do? Right. Asking that is always a great first step. I mean, I want to go back to sort of what Elbert was saying before. And I think one great step is just in terms of allyship is understanding the history, right? Understanding the history of your brothers and sisters, regardless, of your community. Again, I want to go back to, the focus on that. This is not a zero-sum game, right? Like we are all in this together. And I think understanding the history of our Black population, our Latinx population, the Asian American population, knowing that, again, like Elbert pointed out, this is not a new awakening, but a reawakening, like you were saying. And so I think taking the time to understand, for example, like what happened to Vincent Chin, what happened in the Chinese Exclusion Act, what brought that down, right? But then analogizing and understanding how those ties can tie across, right, to other communities. I think that also further strengthens the bond and has us have those aha moments like, wow, we are, truly in this together. But like you were saying, Ray, you got to take care of yourself, right? Take care of yourself is the best blessing to your friends. But, I think learning a bit, right, about your peers is a great first start.
I know, Liz, one of the things that was particularly infuriating about what happened, the tragedy in Atlanta, was when the sheriff, well, first of all, that sheriff was so disgraceful about it. The guy had a bad day, but like almost giving the guy an excuse. Oh, it wasn't a racial thing. It was a sexual thing because he had this thing for the Asian women. And so just particularly from an Asian American woman perspective, your thoughts about how we have to not only confront the racial elements of this and the invisibility, but also the toxic masculinity that's tied into some of those dynamics as it impacts Asian American women.
Yeah, so I think one thing that this moment is bringing out is how little the mainstream, public consciousness really knows about Asian American history, which is really tied into militarism, colonialism, colonization, just all the global violence that happens, and the in particular military violence that happens to women, and all of those things kind of played out in this situation, with assumptions that were made, with how the media framed it, and how it's so different from how the Asian media framed the story, and humanized the folks involved, whereas the mainstream media in the U.S. really just kind of focused on the killer, and then like started putting out all these things about his story. So I think one of the most powerful forms of being a comrade is really just, as all of you have pointed to, learning about each other's history. And for Asian American communities, it really looks at imperialism, militarism, and racism, sexism, how all of those things kind of intersect, which feeds into how Asian American women are perceived and treated here in this country.
Liz, we got to get you on Clubhouse to have that conversation. No, seriously, to have that kind of you and Ben ain't on. We obviously you can come back here whenever you want to have the conversation, but it's almost like we need a long form deal with this with a lot of people because the gender politics around this is so intertwined. And I'm even thinking we're not going to get into all the details of it, but I do remember LB, even going back to the 25-year anniversary, some of the gender dynamics when it came to there were people in the movement that even wanted to minimize the role of some of the Latino and Asian American males because we weren't perceived as quote unquote masculine or like as appealing from like a leader perspective. I'm going there. We're not going to get into names and that's a long history, but my point is that these are conversations we have to continue to have because it's part of the invisibility is taking away even like our humanity, our gender identity. And obviously that's a larger conversation as it relates to, how we are more inclusive now. We're trying to get more inclusive, how people identify themselves. LB, as we wrap up this segment, brother, just any thoughts you have? I mean, we can stay there for hours. These are some of the most important conversations we have on the Found Translation Bomba Live simulcast. And I know, brother, I know you wanted to shout out some folks in New York, but just, this is what it's about, how we figure out how we work together and support each other.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like at the end of the day, I think what I take away from that effort, right? Really, I mean, I think Liz talked about it earlier in terms of the idea of kind of solidarity, and real practical, and Ben has also talked about, real practical solidarity, right? Like not just like some transactional thing, right? But real kind of transformational kind of relationships there, right? And I the thing that always stands in my mind is that we were also dealing with, stereotypes that people had of activism in general, right? of people not remembering whether or not Latinos, and some of that we fed into ourselves, right? I mean, I think, it was interesting. People always thought of and try to position our Asian American friends as like the quiet ones, when reality speaking, those were the biggest people who wanted to throw down and do the most most actionable kind of things, right? It was actually Latinos in that time that had to be kind of brought in to kind of do things. And
I don't want to speak for Liz or anybody that's part of the movement, but I also that was absolutely right. But then part of the other dynamic was within the Asian American student population.
Right, and there was again
being political, like there's a lot of dynamics.
No, and there's and obviously there was a lot of huge thing, even and even on a lot of our campuses, and even today it's even more in terms of what the difference in the relationship between for either first generation students, long-term generation students, foreign students, things like that, especially in terms of at least in a lot of the Ivy Leagues among like Asian versus Asian American, and that whole kind of dynamic, which in our time, certainly Latin American versus Latino was certainly something, but not to the degree in some ways that. But I think especially during, this time of Asian American, AAPI month, in terms of thinking about, again, you're talking about, a lot of times people talk about Latinos not being a monolith. API communities are certainly not a monolith, right? In terms of like the different communities and cultures. Again, we haven't even talked or even spoken about like some of our South Asian, some of our Southeast Asian brothers and sisters who are included in that. And so I think it really is, this is an opportunity for us to kind of not only learn more about each other, but also understand the really hideous ways in which we sometimes even put ourselves and put some of our friends in terms of in boxes, right? And so I think part of it is figuring out how can we create a better world where people can, like we can have a sense of justice and not have to give up, our cultural identities, our political identities to be able to kind of do that, right? But I do want to give again, a strong shout out to a lot of, I think, again, Asian American activists, folks who have been on the front lines. I mean, New York City, folks like, Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence. I mean, you're talking about people who were standing with, in terms of Puerto Rican activists, from day one, in terms of in New York City, fighting against police brutality. And again, a lot of great folks who are doing a lot of great things nationally coming out of that, right? And I think it's really important to understand, that history, and especially for younger folks to understand that there is a tradition in the history that can be tapped into, right? And that hopefully, and in a different way, right? Like we all have different histories, right? And so I just want to make sure to give a shout out, to women like, to women like Aijen, like Liz, like, Sungi Bai, like there's a bunch of people who I think have certainly, proved in their words and since their actions, that they're really committed to justice,
No, for sure. And on the Kello Kid podcast, LB, which of course is covering the comings and goings of Dominicans making moves. I know you breathed a sigh of relief that Fernando Tatis did not break his wrist the other day. So thank God Fernando's okay. He should be back in a few weeks. Ben, brother, give us some jewels as we finish up this conversation. What can give people another practical bit of advice on what people can do moving forward to show allyship and continue this conversation in their own circles?
Absolutely. I think one more tip, right? Aside from learning the history, I think practically speaking, I think I'm similar to everyone else. When we see something terrible happening, right? Let's get trained on what to do, right? To be smart about the situation. But if you can find a training, an upstander or a bystander training, with all the happenings that are going out, like our communities of color, need the support all across. So I think that's one very easy practical step. I actually attended a training this past week. It was an hour. I learned a ton. So, you could do that, right away.
No, and I think people also have to give Asian Americans the opportunity to engage in their own spaces. Obviously, there's one small way I'm doing it.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it's on their media platforms, at their affinity groups, in their businesses, just provide Asian Americans opportunity to have space, to have this conversation, to educate us. Even in the chat, Liz is holding me accountable, so that's good. That's what we're here for. So Ben, brother, let's keep these conversations going. We do need to follow up. We need to do something on Clubhouse really soon.
Absolutely.
With you and Judy, and y'all always have an open door here to the conversations here on the Found Translation Bomba Live simulcast. Liz, you get the final word. First of all, it's so fantastic to see you. We're always, again, that Instagram message chat. We're always talking the good music stuff, but always good conversation with you. You know how much we admire you, my friend. So just want to give you the last word on this segment on this moment in history and how we can keep working together.
Well, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure to be here and catch up with all of you and to meet you, Ben. So I think for me, one of the most important points coming out of this that I think, we can focus on moving forward is just really the deep and pervasive need to have alternatives to the police. I think, abolition is not just the end of something, but it's really the visioning and the growth of like what would be in its place. And so while we're seeing small, things pop up, we need more of those. So the safety teams that Ben was talking about, and just really looking at all the different times when police might be involved in something, whether it's like a intimate partner violence or, just whatever it might be, there are always other, organizations or resources that would be better equipped to handle that situation. And so I think, an idea moving forward that a lot of folks are working on is just how do we create, more resources in all of our communities that can handle lots of different things, they're language specific or that, handle particular issues. So when something happens, the automatic reaction isn't just to call the police. It's there, other folks who can come in and safely and respectfully handle a situation and help people work through it.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, when you're in the neighborhood and in these inner cities, it's illuminating, but also sad in that a lot of times cops get called. It's like neighborhood. It's like just intercommunication stuff. And, and again, to your point, it's there's a lot of different types of skills where unfortunately, and even in fairness to the police, we blanket give them the responsibility to try to deal with when they're underprepared. And in some cases, not really interested in doing, kind of making the peace in certain instances. So Liz Kaufman, our sister, Ben Cheng, good brother, Elbert, my man. This was been a great conversation. We're going to continue the conversation after a quick break with Argentina Beltran, a Filipina leader, actually based in Toronto, talking about the diaspora, which we had a conversation earlier today. Let's continue to conversate. Ben, we need to get on Clubhouse, brother. Keep this going. Judy, I need you to call me Judy, because you're going to be a big part of Bomba Live too. And I just got inside information about some VIP guests we got. You're going to love it, Judy. So if you want the inside scoop, Judy, you got to call me tomorrow, but you're welcome to call me. Ben, Liz, keep these conversations going. It'll be always a pleasure, brother. And again, we're going to take a quick musical break from Fabiola Mendez, who recently appeared on the show with Ben on a recent episode, and Judy. And then we'll see our conversation with Argentina Beltran. Thank y'all, family. Have a great weekend. So great to see you. And let's continue to show allyship with our Asian American brothers and sisters.
Pa escuchar, pero yo sí me encontré con un pajarito pequeño que mientras iba en busca el sol se topó conmigo y a mi oído cantó esta simple melodía. Pero yo sí me encontré con un pajarito pequeño que mientras iba en busca el sol se topó conmigo y a mi oído cantó esta simple melodía.
Welcome back to Bomba Live and the Found Translation simulcast to show the text truth about politics and today's hottest issues. And Bomba Live is our virtual celebration. And this is a very special edition of the show. Again, continue our conversations with our Asian American and Pacific Island brothers and sisters about how do we, not only what's happening now with this current, this wave of hate directed at our AAPI brothers and sisters, but also really spurring on the conversation of what true allyship looks like. And one of the people that I've discovered online, particularly mobilizing people in the Pacific Islander and the Filipino space. And I really say the Filipino diaspora because it's not just the Filipino American community, really a global organizer. And I'm really excited to bring her onto the show. Argentina Beltran is a community collaborator and change ambassador, global connector and brand marketing strategist, and one of the hottest moderators on Clubhouse. So I wanted to bring on the show to talk about, kind of give us an update from the Filipino perspective on this conversation. Argentina, welcome to Found in Translation Bomba Live.
Thank you so much, Rafael. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
It is, first of all, you have a fantastic name, Argentina Beltran. What a wonderful name. But I really admired your leadership, particularly in the last several weeks, as it relates to mobilizing Filipinos. And I really say throughout the world, because you're not a Filipino American, you're actually chiming in from Canada, our friends from the North, correct?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I am in Toronto. And I love how you said my name. You said it correctly, Beltran. So it's so refreshing to hear someone that can actually pronounce it properly.
Well, as we're going to get into the show, there's a lot of allyship, a lot of, you know, at una conversación entre los primos. You know what I'm saying? Puerto Ricans and Filipinos have a lot of shared traditions, and you know, Beltran's a very common name on the island, including Carlos Beltran, who made about $300 million playing baseball. So kind of a hard name to forget. But, you know, I wanted to continue this conversation with you because I wanted to make sure in this conversation earlier we spoke to Liz, Miyoung, and Ben Cheng kind of from the East Asian perspective. But, you know, this is a very diverse conversation on a lot of levels. And your community has been particularly impacted most recently with some of these anti-Asian attacks. So why don't we just start from where you sit as a leader, brand marketer, someone that's got their ear to the online streets, if you will, and you've been really at the centerpiece of a lot of these Clubhouse conversations most recently. Kind of how are you feeling as an activist and just a Filipino in North America, sort of in this time, in this climate?
Well, it's been a lot, right? So the last couple of weeks has been a lot of things happening. So, you know, you can't help but to be worried and anxious, but at the same time, you know, also angry, really. But the way that I process anger is through action. So when all of these things are, you know, going down, my initial thought is, what can I do, right? So right now, that's where my thought process is, what more can I do?
And so getting to that, not only has this scourge impacted the Asian American community broadly, but some of the more recent attacks have disproportionately impacted the Filipino community, in this case, in the States. And so can you share a little bit about sort of how is this most recent series of attacks against Filipinos specifically mobilized the Filipino community online specifically?
Well, one thing that, you know, we talked about the what we share, the Latin community and the Filipino community, what we share is our resilience, right? So what this really pushed us as a community is for us to mobilize and really get organizing. You know, how can we create an impact together as a community? Because, you know, you and I both know that there is definitely strength in numbers, right? So right now we're working with a bunch of different Filipino organizations, trying to bridge the communication, trying to bridge the gap if there's anything, and also trying to support any initiatives that the other organizations have already put in place, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? So that's what I've been focusing on and what my team has been focusing on in terms of how can we support and how can we amplify, is really what we're trying to do right now.
And we're talking to Argentina Beltran, a Filipino North American leader, someone that's very prominent in the diaspora through her social media marketing expertise, and at this point really utilizing that to mobilize the community. So can you share, Argentina, some specific examples of what you're involved in to sort of coordinate? I know there's some efforts sort of on the very day-to-day protecting, particularly Filipino senior citizens and elders and some of the more vulnerable people from your community. And then kind of moving forward, I know there's been some interesting conversations around how is this a mobilization tool to mobilize politically, for example,
Yes,
in another way. So can you share
we are trying to... Yeah, absolutely. So we're trying to, like what I mentioned earlier, communicating with different Filipino organizations. So one is NAFA and the other is NAFCON. They're one of the bigger ones in the US, and also looking for their Canadian counterparts as well. And really looking at the initiatives that they have put in place. And as well as on the political side, because we all know this just didn't happen just a few weeks ago, a few months ago. There's been a long history. We actually, one of the talks that we just had was really understanding and learning the long, ugly history of Asian hate, specifically from a Filipino perspective, when it comes to like in the US in particular, right? So really understanding that, and in terms of how certain policies have an impact in terms of how Filipinos are viewed in the US. And also part of that work is also understanding our history, our own history as Filipinos, because we were colonized so many times by, you know, not just the Spanish, the Americans and the Japanese, right? And really understanding our culture in terms of where do we fit in there, how do we decolonize, and how to really push for what is right, right? So those are the type of talks that we are trying to put focus on. And other than that, you know, really strong focus as well when it comes to mental health, because it is a lot, right? So really trying to show support and really being there as a community.
We're talking to Argentina Beltran, one of our go-to Filipino leaders as it relates to really mobilizing online and really just trying to have this conversation. And for us to understand, just because we're people of color, in my case, Puerto Rican, Latino, doesn't mean that we truly understand. And I want to ask Argentina in a second, how can we truly be allies to in this case, the Pacific Islander Filipino community at this time? Because we think, well, maybe we just reach out to our friends in your community, maybe go to a restaurant, you know, to show allyship. And those, I'm sure those things are nice, but what does it truly mean? And I'm really trying to delve into that conversation with our AAPI friends and allies and people that we're close to in our community. And I'll share in a second my personal, very deep personal connection with the Filipino community. Argentina, you know, I really got a sense of the mobilization happening, which on some levels really exciting. And on a lot of channels, particularly on Clubhouse, which is an app that you and I are both very involved in, and you're, you know, and I have in the crawl here. If you're not following Philly Excellence on Clubhouse, I encourage you to do so and follow the conversations that Argentina's moderating with Filipinos all over the world. It's from all different walks of life. It's fascinating conversations. So tell me about that experience, sort of all of a sudden with your marketing, branding, and social media organizing expertise, all of a sudden on some level becoming kind of like a go-to political leader in a sense through this app on Clubhouse.
It's so interesting. I joined Clubhouse not meaning to be in this position where I'm at right now. I was actually invited by one of my clients who's in the real estate space, and to be part of the panel as a marketing expert. And while I was in that room, you know, one of the people that were present during that talk, she's Filipino, and she just messaged me and said, "Are you Filipino?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And the beauty of Clubhouse is when you follow people, your experience is curated by the people that you follow. And because I follow her, and she was in other Filipino rooms, that's how I got introduced into the Filipino community inside Clubhouse. And from there, it just kind of grew because, you know, there is definitely hunger for discovering our roots, trying to, you know, connect the dots, and really trying to figure out where do we fit in this whole like as our Filipino identity, especially for people in the diaspora, and also people that are from the Philippines and trying to connect to the motherland, right? So having those kind of conversations and having those community inside the app it's really fascinating, the conversations that are happening. And now, the users have really grown so much inside that platform that all of a sudden, from 1 to 3 rooms about Filipino community, now you see a bunch of them, which is really exciting. But I see it like, when you see a neighboring city, you all know each other kind of thing, and you participate in each other's conversation, which is really amazing.
Argentina, I think about, and kind of on some level, I really cherish this conversation. It's time to talk to you about it, because I grew up in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia in that time in the 80s was very segregated. So you had, these different types of ethnic white neighborhoods. Even the white people were segregated. The Irish lived in one area, the Italians lived in one area, what have you. And then, there was a lot of segregated black neighborhoods. And then sort of in between some of the poor black areas and some of the poor white neighborhoods, sort of a Puerto Rican Latino corridor was created. And basically, the Filipinos were a small community. They had nowhere else to live. So they lived with us. So my neighbors, and particularly because of the Catholic cultural connection, I think, that the Filipino family sent their kids to the local Catholic school in the hood, So I remember from like kindergarten to 3rd grade, my best friend was a Filipino young guy, Benjamin Palacios, I remember. And I'm still in touch with his cousin, Sarah, who's a nurse in the Philadelphia area to this day. And those families are still close to us. And so when I was growing up, allyship was sort of like part of the deal. Like, it was we didn't really see any much of a difference. If anything, there was so many similarities with language, culture. And if, people don't know that history, I encourage you to look into it, because of the colonial relationship with Spain. Absolutely. Culturally, there's a lot of connections between religion and being islanders, and a lot of similarities. And so, but fast forwarding, we have some friends in the network. And it's certainly a community that that I have a lot of love for, but at the same time, I'm not going to sit here and say that I've spent a lot of time engaging in these in a lot of these issues from that lens. And so that's why your rooms on Clubhouse are so captivating to me. I listen to them. I'm so compelled, because I realize, it's just great to hear a different perspective, but on some level, and that's kind of the one of the beautiful things about some of these social media platforms. Where else am I going to get this? Where else am I going to hear, people that I very much culturally can relate to? But it is a different slice of the pie, and it's a distinct experience. And in your case, not even being in the United States, being in Canada. But, just having these compelling conversations with people that get very little attention in the media. And I know there's some people that are sort of in the media that a lot of you go to because you're so excited to see some of that representation, even though a lot of it's kind of behind the camera. So I just think on a personal level, it's been a real education for me, and really rewarding just to hear that perspective and have somewhere to hear it and be able to learn from what's happening. So, and I would say this, and I wonder if you agree with this, Argentina, that I think in some ways the Filipino community can be the conduit for the non-Asian American minority communities, particularly Latinos, the way Puerto Ricans sometimes are sort of the conduit with the Black community and Latinos because of our distinct cultural background. So are you finding that sort of Filipinos are almost kind of the connective tissue to discuss the bigger conversation about allyship?
It's so interesting that you mentioned that, because, we always have this conversation, when you're filling out a form, which one do you choose? Asian, Latino, Pacific Islander, for Filipinos specifically, right? Because we're a mix of everybody, really. But in some ways, yes, because there is, I'm sure you can relate to this, because when I enter a Latin room, for example, it's so different, but something about it feels so familiar. So that's probably how you feel as well. So it's similar to like me attending a Latino party, somehow it feels so familiar to me, and something about the shared culture, I think is what it is. And also our shared struggles, right? So as people, there's definitely that connection and that bond. And I don't know if I can actually say that Filipinos would be the conduit between the Asian and the Latino community, but I can see that just because we are essentially both, right? So there's definitely connection in both aspects of our Asianness and our being part of that Latino, being having the same colonizers, right? So yeah, absolutely. I can see how that can be perceived as that.
I got so excited because I think I DM'd you at that point, listening to that conversation on Clubhouse the other day. It was really compelling. You had a great group there, and it was really great conversation. But then the conversation went into adobo and tostones, and I'm like, hold on here, come on now. This is very relatable. And of course, Argentina, Puerto Ricans, and Filipinos have created one of the greatest talents that blesses our country, world. Of course, I'm talking about Bruno Mars. So without us, there's no Bruno. You know what I'm saying? So
Bruno, so I can't argue with that.
without us, there's no Bruno. So what an incredible talent that young man. So, and I know, hey, we both share the credit, so I can't take away from that. His mother actually was the singer. He got his voice from his mother. And she was she died very young. Rest in peace, that woman. But Argentina, as we wrap up this conversation, remind people they can connect with you on social media, because between Clubhouse and your social media marketing and brand ambassadorship expertise, you're someone we definitely want to connect with for business and for continue these activism conversations. And anything else you'd like to share with the Latino community? How can Latinos continue to be allies in this? Unfortunately, this is not going to go away. We're going to share a lot of these struggles together. The immigration fight is something we're doing together. So share with us how we can stay connected with you, and anything else you'd like to share with our audience.
Well, to connect with me, I'm Gabe and Angel, which is the name of my kids. That's my handle on all social media platforms. And also, how do we form an allyship? I always go back to whenever there's a talk about allyship, I always go back to saying supporting the anti-Asian movement is supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, because really a lot of the racism that's existing in the world right now is rooted in anti-Blackness. And by us, I'm talking about the BIPOC community refusing to play the this is Asians against Black or any other races. I refuse to play that, because really that's the white supremacist way of dividing us, right? Because if we can be divided, then we can be manipulated and we can be controlled. So, there's really no talk of, Stop Asian Hate or anything like that without mentioning the plight of the Black community. So really supporting their movement, supporting the anti-racism movement that other communities have endured for a long, long time is really how you show allyship. You don't support one race and then blame the other. That's not how it's going to work.
Wow, what a powerful message. Thank you so much, Argentina. Next time I have you on the show, I actually wanted to talk about twinning, because of your twins. We have some other friends in the network that are raising twins, so that'll be a great conversation. I know you were connected with some of the folks you were interviewing on Instagram on that recently. Argentina Beltran, just a fantastic businesswoman, brand ambassador. Definitely encourage you to keep following her at Gabe and Angel. And we're going to continue the conversations on Clubhouse and on all of our platforms about how we continue to show allyship with the Asian American Pacific Island community. And, a lot of love for our Filipinos always. Argentina, thank you so much, and hope to have you back on the show very soon.
Muchas gracias.